Cop lies to get black teen convicted. Then the boy's defense shocks the entire courtroom. The sun had barely risen when the first scream shattered the routine of the school courtyard. Students stood in small groups, backpacks slung low, trading jokes, snacks, and last-minute homework advice. Terrell Carter was among them, laughing at something his best friend Jordan had just whispered. The morning had felt normal, the kind of ordinary that a 14-year-old learns to treasure in a world that so often turns hostile. But that illusion was ripped away in a heartbeat. "That's him! That's the thief!" The voice cut through the air like a bullet. Everyone turned. A squad car screeched to a halt just beyond the iron gates, lights flashing but sirens off, like a predator creeping up on prey. Before Terrell could even register what was happening, two officers were charging across the concrete. One of them, Officer Halverson, pointed directly at him, his face twisted with a kind of furious certainty that had no room for questions. Terrell's body locked up. What's going on?" he stammered, stepping back instinctively. Halverson didn't answer. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't read any rights. He lunged. Hands grabbed Terrell by the collar, spinning him violently. A knee shoved him forward. His face smacked against the brick wall near the water fountain. The laughter around him died instantly. A silence fell. The stunned kind, the kind that told you the world had just tilted. "Hands behind your back now," Halverson barked. I didn't do anything," Terrell shouted, voice cracking, panic flooding his chest like ice water. He wasn't resisting. He didn't know how. His heart was pounding, not from guilt, but from the paralyzing fear that no one was going to stop this. The cuffs clicked. Tight. Too tight. Students gawked, phones in hand but frozen. Some gasped. A few whispered. Most just stood there, wide-eyed, unable to move, unable to believe that a kid like Tyrell, smart, quiet, with perfect attendance, could suddenly become public enemy number one. "Why are you arresting him?" a teacher called out, finally breaking through the crowd. Ms. Rayburn, the drama coach, pushed past a cluster of kids, eyes wide. "What is this about?" Officer Halverson didn't even turn. "Step back, ma'am. We have a match on the suspect. Surveillance footage. Description fits." Terrell's legs buckled. Surveillance footage? Suspect? He wasn't even anywhere near the shopping district last night. He had been at home studying for his science test, arguing with his mom about missing dinner because he'd been too focused on his robotics project. But none of that mattered now. Halverson shoved him forward, forcing him into a stumbling walk. "You think you can just rob a store and walk into school the next day like nothing happened?" he hissed in Terrell's ear. "I didn't rob anyone," Terrell cried out, his voice echoing across the courtyard. But no one moved. No one helped. The second officer, silent and expressionless, opened the back of the squad car. The cuffs bit deeper into Terrell's wrist with every movement. His backpack, now lying abandoned on the pavement, spilled open. Notebooks, a crushed lunchbox, and a photo of him and his mom at the school science fair sliding out. No one picked it up. Ms. Rayburn tried again, stepping closer. "Wait, this is a mistake. He's one of my students." Halverson turned, his glare like stone. "He matches the description. Black male, hoodie, sneakers. That's all we needed." That sentence was a bullet. 3 words, black, hoodie, sneakers. That was the profile? That was all it took? Tyrell felt rage boiling inside, but fear choked it down. This wasn't justice. This was a decision already made. As he was shoved into the car, the last thing he saw was Jordan, still standing where they had been laughing just moments ago. His friend's face was frozen, not with confusion, but with a terrible understanding, because deep down they both knew. This wasn't about evidence. This was about assumptions. The door slammed. Terrell sat in the back seat, wrists burning, heart racing, tears threatening to fall, but held back by something even stronger. Disbelief. He wasn't just being arrested, he was being erased, and no one seemed brave enough to stop it. The squad car slammed to a stop outside the station, its wheels screeching against the pavement like it couldn't wait to spit Tyrell out. Officer Halverson yanked open the back door without a word and pulled Tyrell by the shoulder, jerking him forward like he wasn't a 14-year-old kid, but a hardened criminal. The cuffs bit into his wrists as he stumbled, his sneakers scraping across the concrete. The air was colder here, thicker, as if the building itself had learned to suffocate the innocent. Inside, the station smelled like sweat, old paper, and something faintly metallic. The scent of fear left behind by people like Terrell, who were dragged through these doors and never the same afterward. A tired-looking clerk barely glanced up from behind a glass divider. Terrell wanted to scream to say, "I didn't do anything," but something in the silence told him it wouldn't matter. Not here. Halverson led him through a side corridor and into a narrow processing room. The walls were pale green, the paint chipped and stained. A single fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, making the shadows twitch. In the middle sat a steel bench and a bolted table. This was no place for truth, just paperwork and punishment. "Sit!" Halverson barked. Terrell hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel the shove between his shoulder blades that forced him down onto the bench. "Take off your shoes." Terrell looked up. "What?" Halverson didn't repeat himself. He stepped forward, pulled out a small knife, and with two fast motions, sliced Terrell's shoelaces off like he was cutting rope on a dangerous animal. The sneakers were yanked off and tossed into a plastic bin, then his belt, then his hoodie, stripped of dignity, stripped of warmth. "You serious right now?" Terrell muttered under his breath. Halverson gave him a look colder than the walls. "Standard procedure for suspects. Get used to it." "Suspects of what?" Terrell asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. That's when Halverson walked over to the small monitor in the corner and turned it on with a click. A grainy black and white video began to play. The footage shook slightly, angled from a high corner of what looked like a hardware store. A figure in a hoodie ran across the screen. Glass shards sparkled midair. A tool, maybe a wrench, flashed in their hand. The face was completely obscured by the hood, the body half hidden in motion blur. Halverson pointed at the screen like he just solved a murder. "There, that's you!" Terrell leaned forward, heart pounding, eyes locked on the screen. "No, it's not. That's not me." "Sure looks like you," Halverson said, voice dripping with mockery. "You can't even see their face," Terrell argued. "That could be anyone." "Black male, hoodie, sneakers," Halverson recited, counting them off on his fingers. "Fits the description to a T." "That's all you have?" Terrell said, stunned. Halverson turned to face him, slowly, deliberately. "Hoodie, sneakers, black. That's enough." The words hit Terrell harder than the concrete floor ever could. "That's enough to ruin someone's life?" he asked, voice rising. "That's enough to lock me in here, take my shoes, treat me like I'm garbage?" Halverson shrugged. "You were in the area. You matched the profile. That's how this works." "No!" Terrell shot to his feet, fists clenched. "That's how you work. That's not justice." Halverson's hand went to his holster, eyes narrowing. "Sit down now." Terrell froze. Every instinct in him screamed to run, but his feet stayed planted. Not because he didn't want to flee, but because he knew it wouldn't matter. They'd shoot him and still say he was resisting. Slowly he sat again, chest heaving, heart thundering in his ears. He looked at the footage one more time, the faceless blur, and realized just how fragile truth had become. Because it didn't matter what he had done. It only mattered what he looked like. The metal door creaked open, and a voice muttered, "You got 5 minutes." The officer didn't wait for a response before disappearing down the hall. Terrell sat up straight on the cold steel bench, his wrists still marked red from the cuffs. His heart was pounding, but not from fear, from something more raw, something deeper. Then she appeared. Angela Carter stormed into the room like a tidal wave of grief and fury, wearing her scrubs from the night shift, the hospital badge still clipped to her chest. Her eyes were swollen, her makeup smudged from tears. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. But she was here. And the second she saw her son, barefoot and hollow-eyed, something inside her cracked. "Oh my God, baby," she whispered, dropping to her knees and pulling him into her arms before he could even speak. Her embrace was trembling, desperate. Terrell didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence between them screamed louder than any words. Behind her, another figure entered. A man in a wrinkled brown suit carrying a battered briefcase and wearing a look that said he'd rather be anywhere else. The public defender. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, I'm Mason. I've been assigned to your son's case. Angela turned her head slightly, eyes still locked on Terrell. Case? He doesn't have a case. He didn't do anything. Mason sighed like he'd heard that 100 times today. That may be, but the DA is moving fast. They're offering a plea deal. Angela stood slowly, her expression hardening. Excuse me? If he pleads guilty to attempted burglary, he avoids trial, Mason said, flipping open a folder. He gets probation, community service, no jail time. It's the best outcome for a case like this. Terrell blinked. Plea deal? His voice was barely above a whisper. Angela looked at the lawyer, then back at her son. He didn't commit a crime. I understand, Mason said almost robotically. But these cases don't often swing in the defendant's favor, especially when there's video footage and an officer's testimony. Video footage that doesn't even show his face, Angela snapped. You mean to tell me my son should lie, say he's guilty of something he didn't do, just so the system doesn't eat him alive? Mason didn't flinch. I'm telling you what will keep him out of prison. Terrell stared at the floor, fists clenched. The room seemed to close in around him. The sound of the flickering light above, the steady ticking of the wall clock, the air conditioning that blew cold, even though he was already shivering. I didn't do it, he muttered. Mason nodded slowly. I believe you, but the courtroom isn't about truth. It's about proof and perception. And right now, you're a black kid in a hoodie, accused of robbery, and a cop says he saw you. That's enough to convince a jury. Angela's face went pale. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Terrell looked up at her, eyes wide and filled with something between terror and disbelief. If I say I did this just to go home, he whispered, and I know I didn't, then who am I, Mom? Angela didn't answer. Would I still be me? He asked, voice cracking, because it doesn't feel like it. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. Her baby, her sweet, nerdy, curious little boy, had never asked her anything she couldn't answer. Until now. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was no more shaking, no more tears, only steel. We're not signing anything, she said. Mason sighed, closing the folder. Mrs. Carter, I need to be honest. If this goes to trial, your son could be found guilty. That means a juvenile record, maybe even time. You're taking a risk. Angela nodded. I've taken risks my whole life. Worked 3 jobs, raised this boy on my own. Taught him to stand for what's right, even when it's hard. You think I'm going to teach him now to bow to fear? Terrell's chest swelled with emotion. Not pride, not yet. But something close. Something like hope. Like a flicker of light in a room built to keep people in the dark. Angela stepped closer to the lawyer. If this system wants to steal my son's future, they'll have to fight us for it, because we're not giving it up willingly. Mason stared at her, expression unreadable. Then he slowly nodded. Okay, then we prepare for trial. He turned to leave but paused at the door. Just be ready. Trials aren't fair. They're brutal. Angela didn't look away. So are mothers. The door closed behind him with a click. Terrell sat there in silence for a moment, then turned to his mom. I'm scared, he admitted. Angela pulled him close again, brushing his hair with her fingers. Me too, she whispered. But scared doesn't mean weak, and it damn sure doesn't mean wrong. She kissed his forehead. We'll fight. And no matter what they throw at us, you stay true to who you are. That's how we win. And in that small windowless room, buried inside a system built to break people like them, a mother and son made a choice. Not the easy one, not the safe one, but the right one. And it would change everything. The juvenile holding center was nothing like school. There were no bells, no recess, no laughter, only echoing footsteps, steel doors, and the hollow clank of keys turning in locks. The hallways reeked of bleach and hopelessness. Tyrell sat alone at a metal table in the rec room, his arms folded, eyes scanning the chipped paint on the walls like he could read the ghost trapped inside them. Days had passed since his arrest, but time moved strangely here. Not forward, just in circles. Then a voice broke the stillness. "You don't look like the kind of kid who belongs in here." Terrell turned. Standing in the doorway was an older black man in a faded suit jacket, holding a thick leather binder under one arm. His posture was straight, his eyes sharp behind wireframe glasses. There was something calm about him, something different from the guards, the officers, even the lawyers. "Name's Mr. Brown," he said, walking over and setting the binder on the table. "I teach kids in the system about the law, the same law that most of them never get the chance to understand before it chews them up." Terrell didn't respond. He had nothing left to say to strangers. Mr. Brown didn't seem bothered. He took a seat across from him and opened the binder, revealing handouts, diagrams, and old court transcripts. "You're Tyrell Carter, accused of burglary. Matching a description? Hoodie, sneakers, black," Brown said without looking up. "Same 3 strikes that seem to convict a lot of innocent boys before the trial even begins." Terrell's eyes narrowed. "You here to tell me to take a deal, too?" Brown finally looked up, and his voice dropped lower, firmer. "I'm here to teach you how to fight back." Terrell blinked. The idea sounded foreign, like a language he hadn't heard since he was free. "Fight back how?" "With your mind, with knowledge," Brown said. He slid a document across the table, a basic breakdown of courtroom procedures. "You want to survive this system? You learn how it works, you learn their rules, and you beat them at their own game." Terrell leaned in, scanning the page. Words like reasonable doubt, chain of custody, cross-examination. His heart pounded harder, not in fear, but in something close to defiance. "I don't have a lawyer who listens. I don't even know what half these terms mean." Brown smiled. "Then we start from the beginning. Tonight." The moment Mr. Brown left, Terrell's brain was already spinning. His hands trembled, not from fear this time, but urgency. He needed to move, to do something, to take back even a fragment of the power that had been ripped away from him the moment Halverson slapped those cuffs on his wrists. That night, under the flickering ceiling light of his holding cell, Terrell asked the guard for one thing: paper. By some miracle, they brought him a cheap spiral notebook and a dull pencil. Mr. Brown returned not long after, carrying a small stack of books, thick legal guides, old but not useless, pages heavy with ink and potential. He dropped them onto the floor just outside the bars. "Start with these," he said. "Read everything. Don't just memorize, understand." Terrell pulled the books through the slot one by one, his heart thudding like a war drum. This was his lifeline, his weapon, his shot. He started reading right there on the concrete floor, legs folded, back against the wall. The first chapter was brutal, legal terminology and dense blocks of text. But he forced himself through every line, underlining key terms with the tip of the pencil, making notes in the margins like he was studying for a final exam that would determine whether he lived or disappeared. And in a way, it was exactly that: chain of custody. He learned how a piece of evidence moves from the crime scene to the courtroom, how every hand it passed through had to be documented. One mistake, one undocumented transfer, and the whole thing could be thrown out. He remembered Halverson never mentioned where the alleged stolen tools went. No log, no proof. That mattered. Reasonable doubt. Terrell read that a jury couldn't convict unless they were certain beyond reasonable doubt. Not maybe. Not seems like. They had to be sure. And suddenly the blurry footage, the lack of fingerprints, the misidentification, all of it became more than just unfair. It became ammunition. He flipped to the next book, a compilation of wrongful conviction cases. Names like Khalif Browder and the Central Park Five stared back at him. Kids like him, accused like him, thrown into cages and forgotten like him. He read every detail, how coerced confessions, biased policing, and indifferent courts shattered innocent lives. He felt his stomach twist. These weren't just horror stories, they were warnings. By 2 a.m., Terrell's eyes were bloodshot, but he kept writing. He scribbled lists in the margins. No stolen goods found, no fingerprints, suspect taller than me. Video quality too low, Halverson has prior complaints. Each bullet point was a heartbeat, a reason to fight. Sometime before dawn, Mr. Brown returned. He stood outside the cell, and watched Terrell flipping pages like a man possessed. "You slept?" the old man asked. Terrell shook his head, not looking up. "Didn't have time," Brown chuckled. "You planning to pass the bar next week?" "I'm planning to not get buried," Terrell replied. Brown nodded, impressed. Then he stepped closer and asked the question that had been hanging in the air all night. "You think you can beat them?" Terrell didn't answer at first. He looked down at his notes, his messy handwriting, his underlined phrases, his furious arrows and circles. Then he looked up. "Can I win?" he asked quietly. Brown met his eyes. "If you can tell the truth the right way, you can make people hear it." Terrell leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. Those words echoed in his chest like a war cry. This wasn't just about knowledge. It was about strategy, about delivery, about taking the truth, his truth, and wielding it like a sword. He looked at Brown. "Then teach me how to say it so they listen." The old man smiled. "Gladly. Let's get to work." And just like that, the cell wasn't a prison anymore. It was a classroom, a war room, a battleground. And Tyrell Carter wasn't just some scared kid anymore. He was preparing for war. The courtroom was colder than Terrell expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Everything inside felt sterile, impersonal, stripped of empathy. The walls were a dull beige, the carpet thin and fraying at the edges, and yet the silence held more weight than concrete. Terrell sat at the defendant's table, dressed in an ill-fitting shirt and slacks provided by the center. His hands were folded in front of him, but his fingers twitched against one another. Nerves, pressure, and fury all colliding beneath the surface. To his left, the public defender, Mr. Mason, flipped lazily through a thin stack of papers. He didn't glance at Terrell, not once, just adjusted his glasses and scribbled something half-heartedly in the margins. Tyrell could feel it. The man had already given up. This wasn't a trial to him. It was a formality. Across the room, Officer Halverson sat upright, dressed in his crisp blue uniform, the badge gleaming under the courtroom lights like a shield of untouchable authority. His posture was perfect, his jaw locked, his eyes dead calm. He looked like a man confident in the outcome, because he'd seen it before, many times. The judge entered, a man with gray hair and a voice like gravel, and the trial officially began. The prosecutor stood first. She was tall, poised, dressed in a navy suit tailored like a blade. Her heels clicked like gunshots as she walked to the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is simple. We have a victim, a robbery, and a suspect who matches the description caught on surveillance footage. A young man, hoodie, sneakers, approximately 5 feet 8 inches, seen fleeing the scene of a break-in with stolen goods in hand. And shortly after, Mr. Tyrell Carter was found just blocks away, wearing similar clothing, acting suspiciously. We believe the evidence speaks for itself." Then she clicked a remote. The screen behind her flickered to life. A black and white video played, shaky and grainy, showing a hooded figure sprinting past a shattered storefront. The suspect's face was a blur, indistinct and hidden, just movement and chaos in a swirl of pixels. No sound, no timestamp, no clear ID. Tyrell stared at the footage, heart pounding. He'd watched it 100 times already. It had no truth, no justice, just ambiguity. But here in this room, it was being presented as gospel. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "You've seen the tape. Now let's hear from the man who made the arrest." Halverson rose like he was climbing into a throne. He swore himself in, then sat confidently on the witness stand. "Officer," the prosecutor began smoothly, "can you walk us through what happened the morning of the arrest?" Halverson nodded, voice steady. "I received a call about a break-in on East 19th Street. I arrived within minutes. Witnesses described a black male, wearing a dark hoodie and sneakers, fleeing the scene. I canvassed the area and spotted the defendant walking several blocks away, matching that exact description. Was he acting suspiciously?" Halverson didn't even blink. "Yes, he avoided eye contact, adjusted his hoodie when he saw me. I approached him and he became visibly nervous. That confirmed my instincts." Terrell clenched his jaw. Liar! He hadn't even seen Halverson coming. The man had charged at him without a word. "And did you find any stolen items on him?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Halverson admitted, "but the proximity, clothing, and behavior, combined with the footage, gave me probable cause." She nodded like that was enough. Like the absence of evidence could be spun into proof. The judge turned to the defense. "Cross-examination." Mr. Mason slowly stood, buttoned his jacket, and ambled forward like he was killing time in line at a grocery store. "Officer, you said the suspect matched the description?" Halverson nodded. "Hoodie, sneakers, black?" "Yes." "And that was enough to make an arrest?" Halverson hesitated just a beat. "In combination with the timing and location, yes." Mason nodded and turned toward the jury, then shrugged. "Nothing further." "Nothing. That was it." Terrell blinked, stunned. That was his defense? That the cop kind of guessed right? He turned to Mason, whispering, "That's all you're going to say?" Mason didn't look at him. "It's not smart to antagonize the jury." Terrell sat back, his hands trembling. Rage boiled inside him, but there was no outlet. The truth was burning a hole in his chest, and no one seemed interested in hearing it. Terrell's palms were sweating as he rose slowly from his seat at the defendant's table. The courtroom, moments ago buzzing with quiet murmurs, fell completely silent. Even the judge, and who had shown little interest in the proceedings so far, looked up with mild surprise. "Your Honor," Terrell said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his chest. "May I speak on my own behalf?" The judge arched an eyebrow, considering. Then he nodded. "You may proceed." Terrell took a breath, stepped forward, and turned to face the jury. 12 strangers who held his life in their hands. His heart thundered in his ears, but he kept his voice clear. "I want to talk about the footage," he said. "The same video they just showed you. I've watched it, over and over." He pointed to the screen, now frozen on the blurred figure in the hoodie mid-stride. "You can't see the person's face. You can't tell what color their eyes are, or how they talk, or even how they move. But there's one thing you can tell, if you're paying attention." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to ask a question. How tall is the suspect in the video?" The prosecutor stirred. "Objection. The footage is inconclusive." Terrell cut in, turning toward the jury. "No, it's not. The footage was recorded at the front of the store, right by the door. And like most businesses, that door has a height chart sticker placed vertically along the frame, for security reasons." He stepped closer to the screen. "If you slow the video down, you'll see the suspect pass that door frame. The top of their head lines up with the 5'8" mark." He turned around again, shoulders back. "I'm 5'4". The jury shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. "I've been the same height for a year," Terrell said. "My doctor's record confirms it. I've got it with me." The judge motioned for him to hand it to the bailiff. Terrell passed over a folded document he'd begged Mr. Brown to print for him the day before. As the judge read it silently, Terrell pressed on. "They said I matched the description," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "But what does that even mean? Hoodie? Sneakers? Black? That's not a description. That's a stereotype." He turned to Halverson, eyes blazing. "You didn't ask me any questions. You didn't check my ID. You didn't care about the truth. You just saw someone who looked like your idea of guilty and decided I was it." The judge leaned forward. "Prosecution, can you confirm the height discrepancy?" The prosecutor hesitated. "The video quality makes precise measurements difficult." Terrell shook his head. "No, it doesn't. That height scale is there for a reason. And I'm telling you now, if the suspect is 5'8", it can't be me." Silence. The kind that weighs heavy in a room. Kind that means something just cracked. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Terrell saw it. The flicker of doubt. Not in himself, but in them. The silence in the courtroom had grown dense. The kind that didn't just hang in the air, but pressed down on everyone in the room. Terrell stood motionless for a moment, his breath even, his hands no longer trembling. He'd chipped a crack into the prosecution's story with the height discrepancy, but now he was about to take a sledgehammer to the entire foundation. He reached into his file folder, a folder he had spent every sleepless night poring over with Mr. Brown's help, and carefully unfolded a set of stapled documents. The paper was worn at the corners, annotated in pencil, and underlined in bold strokes. This wasn't just evidence. This was truth, and it had teeth. Your Honor, Terrell said, holding the papers up for the judge to see, I'd like to submit additional material into the record. The judge peered over his glasses. What is it? Terrell turned to face the courtroom. It's Officer Halverson's disciplinary history, public record, 3 formal complaints for wrongful arrest, all involving young black males within the last 5 years. A murmur shot through the gallery like electricity. The prosecutor was already on her feet. Objection, Your Honor. That's not relevant to the current case. But Terrell raised his voice, cutting through the objection like a knife. It's relevant when the man accusing me of a crime has a pattern of targeting kids who look like me and locking them up without real evidence. The judge hesitated, eyes narrowing as he motioned for the bailiff to retrieve the document. As it made its way across the courtroom, Terrell didn't back down. He looked directly at the jury now, no longer just a scared boy pleading for freedom, but a witness to something larger. 3 kids, he said, holding up his fingers. 3 separate cases. Each time, Halverson claimed he had a gut instinct. Each time, there was little or no physical evidence, and each time, those charges were later dropped or overturned. But only after those boys had already been processed, traumatized, and labeled as criminals. He pointed toward the prosecution's table. They'll tell you that those cases have nothing to do with mine, that history shouldn't matter. But I ask you, how many mistakes does it take before it stops being a mistake? Halverson's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected this. His composure cracked, just slightly. Tyrell saw it. So did the jury. My name is Tyrell Carter, he continued. I get good grades. I've never been in a fight. I was walking to school with a science notebook in my bag. But none of that mattered to Officer Halverson. What mattered was that I was wearing a hoodie. What mattered was the color of my skin. His voice dropped to a quieter register. Intense. Intimate. This isn't just about me. It's about every kid who's ever been told they look suspicious without ever doing anything wrong. It's about every officer who's learned they can ruin lives and still go home with a paycheck. And it's about a system that keeps letting them. He turned to the judge. I may be 14, but I know what justice is supposed to look like. And this isn't it. The judge, still thumbing through the report, looked troubled now. He adjusted his robe and finally addressed the prosecutor. Do you deny these prior complaints exist? The prosecutor's face was tight. We don't deny them, Your Honor, but they were never proven to show misconduct. Tyrell stepped forward again, his voice unwavering. Tell that to the kids who spent weeks in holding cells. Tell that to the parents who thought their sons were gone for good. Just because the system didn't punish Halverson doesn't mean he didn't do it. Halverson finally spoke up from the witness stand, voice sharp. This is character assassination. He's trying to poison the jury with irrelevant history. Terrell spun toward him. You did that yourself, officer. I'm just showing them the receipts. The gallery gasped. The prosecutor tried again. Your Honor, we request this line of argument be stricken. But the judge held up his hand. Number, let it stay. The jury will decide the weight of the officer's past behavior. Terrell stepped back, his heart hammering, but he refused to let it show. He had walked into this courtroom accused, underestimated, nearly silenced. But now the jury wasn't looking at him with suspicion. They were seeing something else. A boy who had been hunted not by evidence, but by a man with a pattern that had been ignored for far too long. And finally, someone had said it out loud. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The courtroom was deathly still, the kind of silence that doesn't come from lack of sound, but from the weight of truth pressing down on everyone's chest. Terrell stood in the center of that pressure, facing the witness stand like a soldier staring down his enemy. The air crackled with tension. He knew this was his moment, not just to survive, but to expose the entire lie. He turned back to Halverson, his voice sharp and steady. Officer, you said I matched the suspect's description. Hoodie, sneakers, black. But let's talk about the sneakers. Halverson's eyes flicked to the prosecutor, then back to Terrell. What about them? You saw the video. You claimed I matched the clothing. So let me ask you, did you even check my shoes when you arrested me? Halverson hesitated, just for a split second, but it was enough. A pause too long, a breath too measured. I looked at them. Yes, he muttered. Terrell didn't blink. Did you compare them to the ones the suspect was wearing in the footage? Another pause, longer this time. I believe they were similar. Similar, Terrell echoed, walking a step closer. Because I've seen the footage. The suspect's shoes had a white stripe across the side. Mine didn't. The tread was different. Even the color was off. You never verified a match. You just assumed. Halverson's face reddened. We don't always have time, Terrell cut him off. You had time to throw me against a wall, time to cuff me in front of my classmates, time to strip me of my shoelaces and dignity. But you didn't have time to look at my shoes? A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Terrell turned to the jury now, his voice rising not in volume, but in intensity. A calm storm building behind every syllable. Do you know what that means? It means this officer, the same one with a history of false arrests, looked at me and wanted me to be guilty. He didn't need facts. He didn't need truth. Just a feeling. He looked back at Halverson, eyes burning. You didn't investigate me. You profiled me. The judge shifted in his chair. The prosecutor leaned forward, ready to object. But even she could sense the room had changed. The momentum was slipping. The story was unraveling. Terrell lowered his voice, letting the silence carry the weight of what came next. Belief is not evidence, he said. It's not truth. It's not proof. Belief is a shortcut. Belief is what people use when they've already made up their minds. And in the wrong hands, belief becomes an excuse to destroy someone's life. He faced the jury fully now. This man believed I was guilty. That's why I'm here. Not because of facts, not because of evidence, but because of belief, shaped by bias, fueled by assumption. He took a breath, steadying himself. But justice doesn't run on belief. It runs on proof, on facts, on fairness. His hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists at his sides. If we let belief be enough, if we let people like Officer Halverson decide guilt based on a hunch, then no one who looks like me will ever be safe. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Raw, final. Halverson sat stiffly, his jaw locked, his silence louder than any denial. And Tyrell? He stood tall, a 14-year-old boy who had been treated like a criminal, thrown into the system, and forgotten. Now standing in the very place where truth was supposed to matter, and forcing the room to finally listen. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp, deliberate. The sound echoed through the courtroom like the crack of a rifle. We'll recess for 30 minutes, he announced, his voice firm. This court needs time to review the new evidence and weigh its relevance before proceeding. Just like that, the spell of the trial was momentarily broken. The jury filed out slowly, casting sideways glances at Tyrell as they exited. Some looked unsure, others quietly shaken. But no one looked at him the way they had when the trial began. Not like a criminal, not like a threat. Something had shifted. Tyrell stood still at the defense table, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He barely heard the scraping of chairs, the low murmurs from the gallery, or the rustling of papers. All he could feel was the storm inside him, a mixture of hope, fear, and disbelief. He had thrown everything he had into that last hour. Every fact, every ounce of courage, every sleepless night he'd spent studying the law in a cold concrete cell. And now, all he could do was wait. His mother came to his side during the recess, gently taking his hand in both of hers. Her eyes were brimming with tears, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She just looked at him and whispered, "No matter what they say, you already won." He nodded, but he didn't answer. His mind wouldn't let him believe it. Not until he heard it. Not until the words were spoken out loud for the world to hear. When the court reconvened, the room felt heavier than before. The jury re-entered in a tight, silent line. They took their seats with unreadable expressions. The judge returned last, flipping open a folder with a quiet seriousness that made Terrell's stomach twist. "All parties present?" the judge asked. The bailiff nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned toward the jury box. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man in a navy sweater vest, stood slowly. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand, the weight of justice pressed into a single sheet. "We have, Your Honor." The paper was passed to the judge. He opened it, scanned the words, then handed it back with a nod. The foreman cleared his throat. The room held its breath. "In the matter of the state versus Tyrell Carter," he began, voice steady but charged with emotion, "on the charge of attempted burglary, we find the defendant." A pause, a second stretched into eternity. "I'm not guilty." The words shattered the air like a lightning strike. For a moment, no one moved. The entire courtroom seemed frozen in time, locked in that surreal instant when truth finally breaks through the wall of assumption. Tyrell couldn't breathe. His mother gasped beside him, a hand flying to her mouth. Then the room erupted, a collective exhale. Gasps, cries, the shuffle of reporters rising to their feet. The bailiff called for order, but his voice was lost in the waves of noise. Tyrell just stood there, blinking, as if trying to process the impossible. He was free. The gavel hadn't even stopped echoing when the judge leaned forward, eyes locked on the prosecution bench. His tone shifted. No longer procedural, but powerful, like thunder rolling through the room. "This court," he began, voice resonating with righteous weight, "has not only reviewed the evidence, but has also heard credible testimony, exposed contradictions in sworn statements, and witnessed alarming patterns of behavior that raise serious concerns regarding the conduct of arresting officer Roy Halverson." The room stilled once again. No rustling, no whispers. Even the press held their breath, pens frozen midair. Tyrell turned slowly to look at Halverson, still seated on the witness stand, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid. But the confidence he'd worn like armor was gone now, stripped away by the slow, deliberate collapse of his narrative. The judge continued, his words slicing through the air like blades. "In light of Officer Halverson's disciplinary record, inconsistencies in his testimony, and failure to follow standard investigative procedures, I am formally recommending an internal investigation be opened by the District Attorney's Office. Effective immediately, Officer Halverson is suspended from active duty pending the outcome of said investigation." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Tyrell's heart stopped for a second, not in fear but in disbelief. The man who had dragged him from school in cuffs, who had looked him in the eye and seen nothing but guilt, was finally being held accountable. The judge wasn't finished. "This court believes that the rights of the accused were violated not by accident, but by design, and that can no longer be ignored." Halverson's face went red. He opened his mouth, but the judge cut him off with a sharp glare. "Officer Halverson, I strongly advise you to remain silent. Anything further you say may be used against you in your disciplinary proceedings." It was the kind of silence Tyrell had dreamed of. Not the choking, oppressive kind he had felt in his holding cell, but the silence of power shifting, of justice finally turning its head in the right direction. The judge turned his gaze to Tyrell. His voice softened, just slightly. "Mr. Carter, you are free to go." 4 words, just 4, but they shattered a cage that had wrapped itself around Tyrell's heart for days, maybe years. The bailiff stepped forward to remove the last symbolic shackle, the security escort that had flanked him since the beginning. Tyrell didn't flinch. He stood slowly, chest rising with each breath, his legs shaking with release. He took one step, then another toward the gallery. Angela was already moving. She pushed through the swinging gate of the courtroom like a dam breaking, rushing into her son's arms. The moment they collided, the flood came. Tears that had waited too long, pain that had been buried under armor, now pouring out freely. "I've got you," she whispered, voice cracked but strong. "I've got you, baby." Tyrell buried his face in her shoulder, clutching her as if she were the only thing keeping him upright. And maybe she was, because in that moment, every headline, every slur, every shadow of doubt vanished under the weight of a mother's arms. The reporters snapped photos. The prosecutor shuffled papers, avoiding eye contact. Halverson sat stone still, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Justice had a face now, and it wasn't his. Angela pulled back just enough to cup Terrell's face in her hands. "You did it," she whispered through the tears. "You made them see." He shook his head, tears streaming freely now. "We did." They turned together toward the doors of the courtroom, and as they walked, the crowd, even the skeptical ones, parted for them. Not because they were ordered to, but because in that moment, Tyrell Carter wasn't just a kid who beat the system. He was a symbol of what it meant to survive it. And for the first time in days, he walked forward without chains, toward the light, toward the world, toward a future that, for once, felt like his. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters, their microphones stretched like claws. Cameras flashing in staccato bursts as Tyrell Carter emerged from the building. No longer a defendant, but a free young man. His mother stood beside him, gripping his hand with pride and exhaustion. Security guards tried to form a barrier, but the crowd was insistent, hungry for a soundbite, a quote, anything that could capture what had just unfolded inside. "Tyrell, how does it feel to be free? What would you say to Officer Halverson right now? Do you believe the justice system failed you?" The questions came like bullets, fast, relentless, aimed not just at Tyrell's story, but at the deeper rot they all sensed underneath. For a moment, Tyrell said nothing. He looked up at the cloudy sky, inhaled the fresh air he hadn't tasted in days, and felt it settle in his lungs like fire and clarity all at once. Then he turned to the cameras and said in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade, "I shouldn't have had to prove I was innocent. The system should have had to prove it was right." Silence, a beat of raw, electric silence. And then, pens scribbled. Cameras zoomed in. Heads nodded. Because he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for all the others who never got the chance. That quote made headlines within the hour. By nightfall, it was being shared across the country, reposted, reprinted, and echoed on every screen. But Tyrell didn't stop there. He wasn't interested in a viral moment. He wanted a movement. Within weeks, he launched Innocence for Youth, a grassroots organization dedicated to identifying, investigating, and supporting cases where minors were wrongfully accused or coerced into plea deals they didn't understand. His vision was clear. No child should ever face what he did. Stripped of dignity, presumed guilty, and thrown into a legal meat grinder without a voice. He didn't wait for adults to lead the charge. He built the group from the ground up, using school libraries, social media, and connections with other youth advocates. He recruited other teens who had faced similar injustice. Some had been locked up for stealing candy they never touched. Others had been coerced into confessions for crimes they didn't even witness. Together, they poured through public arrest records. They studied policies. They sent letters to courts. They held weekend workshops where they taught kids what Miranda rights really meant and why silence was sometimes the only protection they had. At first, people called it ambitious. A few laughed. Some dismissed it outright. But then the first case reopened. A 13-year-old girl in another city had been arrested for vandalism, based solely on a witness saying she was the only black kid in the park. No fingerprints, no footage, nothing but assumption. Tyrell's team found inconsistencies in the police report, linked up with a civil rights attorney, and brought the case to local media. The charges were dropped within 3 weeks. Then came the second case. A teenage boy with autism, arrested during a school fight he never participated in. His disability was ignored during questioning. He'd been ready to plead guilty just to get home. By the third case, news outlets weren't calling Tyrell a former defendant anymore. They were calling him a youth justice advocate. Still, behind every win, Tyrell carried the weight of the truth. That he was lucky. He had a mother who fought, a librarian who cared, a mentor who believed. Most kids didn't have that. And that's what drove him forward. Not anger, not revenge, but responsibility. Late one night, after responding to yet another message from a desperate family, Tyrell looked at the mission statement scrawled across the whiteboard in his small community office. "We don't fix the system, we protect each other from it." And in those words, he found the fuel to keep going. because he knew the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The classroom wasn't fancy, just an old rec center room with mismatched chairs, flickering lights, and a whiteboard that creaked when you wrote on it. But to Tyrell, it might as well have been a courtroom, because every Saturday morning, that's what he turned it into. He stood at the front, wearing a hoodie and jeans, marker in hand, facing a dozen kids around his age, some younger, some older, all from neighborhoods like his. Kids who had already seen the sharp edge of the system. Some had brothers behind bars, others had been stopped and searched just for walking home, and all of them had questions the world never bothered to answer. Tyrell intended to change that. "All right," he began, underlining the words, "probable cause" on the board with a hard stroke. "Let's start with the truth. The system is not designed to protect you. It's designed to control you. But knowing your rights is how you take some of that power back." The room was quiet, not out of boredom but focus. These weren't kids who needed to be convinced to care. They already knew what was at stake. They'd lived it. Tyrell paced slowly. "They'll tell you if a cop thinks you're suspicious, that's enough. But suspicion without evidence? That's nothing. That's how they locked me up. That's how they almost buried me." He turned and wrote in large, bold letters, "Reasonable doubt. This," he said, pointing, "is your shield. If they can't prove you did it beyond this point, they can't convict you. But here's the problem. Most of us don't even know we're allowed to fight back. So we don't. We take the plea deal. We stay quiet. We let fear do their job for them." One kid, a quiet boy in the back wearing a gray hoodie too big for his frame, raised his hand. "What if they lie like that officer did to you? What if they say you match the description, even if you didn't?" Tyrell nodded slowly. "Then you don't panic. You ask questions. You demand the evidence. You say nothing else. And you remember, it's not your job to prove you're innocent. It's their job to prove you're guilty." He held up a printout, a copy of a police report from a real case the group had studied the week before. "Let's break this down," he said, handing out copies. "This report says the officer saw the suspect run from the scene, but there's no timestamp, no camera angle, and no mention of physical evidence. That's a red flag. That's where you dig." The kids leaned in, reading, circling notes, just like Tyrell had done on the floor of his cell not long ago. But now he was the one handing out the tools, the one lighting the path, because he knew what it felt like to walk into a courtroom and be presumed guilty based on the color of your skin and the cut of your clothes. He knew what it meant to have no voice and what it took to find one. Every lesson was a strike against that silence. Every kid who walked out of that room knowing their rights was a crack in the system that tried to crush him. And Tyrell wasn't just teaching the law. He was building an army of truth, one student at a time. Tyrell stood in the center of the old battered classroom, sunlight streaming through cracked windows, painting bright slashes of gold across the floor. The worn desks were filled with faces, young and tired, some still scarred by disbelief, others cautiously hopeful. Kids just like him, who'd learned far too soon how easily innocence could be shattered by a system that saw guilt first and asked questions later. The room went quiet as Tyrell stepped forward, a calm determination radiating from his small frame. He no longer trembled. He no longer felt the ache of uncertainty gripping his chest. He'd walked through fire and emerged forged into something stronger, unbreakable, a force the world had not anticipated. "Today," Tyrell began, his voice clear and steady, "I'm going to teach you about the two most powerful tools you have when facing a system that isn't built to protect us." He turned slowly, letting his eyes rest briefly on each of his classmates. They leaned forward instinctively, hungry for knowledge he'd paid dearly to earn. "The right to remain silent," he said clearly, deliberately, letting each word land like a punch. "And the right to have an attorney." Tyrell paused, inhaling sharply. He remembered vividly how silence had once felt like weakness to him. The unbearable quiet of the interrogation room, the accusing eyes of officers who saw his skin and clothing as evidence enough. But now he understood silence wasn't surrender. Silence was armor, a shield to stop unjust accusations from breaking through. He wrote on the board in bold letters, the marker squeaking sharply across its surface, "You have the right to remain silent. No matter what they say to you, how they threaten or promise, you never have to speak, he continued firmly, because the moment you do, your words stop belonging to you. They become theirs, twisted, reshaped, and turned against you. Silence is your best protection. He saw nodding around the room. Many of these kids had known the kind of silence imposed by fear, the choking kind, the kind that came from powerlessness. Terrell was teaching them a different kind. Silence as a deliberate act of resistance. His voice rose slightly now, fueled by memories still sharp enough to cut. They will tell you silence is guilt, that not speaking proves you have something to hide. But remember this, Terrell said, tapping the board fiercely. It's not your job to prove you're innocent. It's theirs to prove you're guilty. Murmurs filled the classroom, a ripple of understanding. Terrell took another step closer, now barely inches from the front row. He could see himself in their eyes, remembering how small he'd felt, how voiceless, trapped in that courtroom beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like hornets, the cold gaze of Halverson stripping away his humanity, piece by piece. And that's why you need an attorney, he continued, voice intense and unyielding. Because the system wasn't built for people who look like us. It's stacked with codes and procedures that confuse and intimidate you into surrendering your rights. Your attorney is the translator, your shield. Your voice when they try to silence yours? Terrell turned to the board again, writing slowly, deliberately. You have the right to an attorney. He faced the class once more, letting the words hang in the air, tangible and potent. Never waive this right. Never let them convince you that needing help makes you weak. An attorney isn't a privilege. It's a lifeline. A younger boy raised a trembling hand, his eyes wide with anxiety. But what if they don't listen? What if they hurt us anyway? The room grew tense, breathless. Terrell recognized the fear instantly. It was a question he had once asked himself, sitting alone behind iron bars, wrists still sore from cuffs tightened without reason. He moved slowly to kneel in front of the boy, meeting his gaze with unshakable conviction. They might try, Terrell admitted gently, because injustice isn't accidental. It's built into the bones of a system that looks at us and sees only suspicion. But knowledge, courage, and unity are stronger. When we speak out, when we refuse to play by their rules, when we insist they play by ours, that's when their power starts to crumble. He stood once more, turning toward the others, speaking louder now, every word gaining momentum. Because what happened to me wasn't rare, he continued sharply. I was lucky. I fought and I won. But there are countless others, kids just like you and me, who weren't so fortunate. Kids whose stories won't ever make headlines. Kids locked away because no one showed them the truth, because no one stood beside them and said, "This stops here." His voice grew harder, cutting through the stillness like steel. I refuse to accept that reality, he said fiercely. I refuse to let this continue. Because I didn't just win for me, I won for every single kid who will come after, who might stand where I stood and feel like they don't matter. His eyes blazed now, not with rage, but with clarity, a fire tempered by the knowledge that he'd faced the darkest corners of a system meant to crush him, and he had survived. So I'm here to tell you, you matter, Terrell said forcefully. Your voice matters. Your silence matters. Your rights matter. And as long as I'm breathing, I'll make sure every single one of you knows how to use those rights to protect yourself. I'll make sure none of you face what I did alone. The classroom erupted in applause, fierce and powerful, the kind of applause that came from kids who'd finally heard someone speak their truth aloud. Terrell felt tears threaten to blur his vision, but he blinked them away, standing strong at the center of it all. His mother stood quietly in the doorway, eyes glistening with pride, her hand pressed to her chest, watching the boy she'd raised, the boy who'd survived, transform into the leader these kids desperately needed. Terrell took a deep breath, letting the applause slowly fade. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, powerful. We won't ever let them silence us again, he vowed, because our truth is louder than their lies. Outside, beyond the cracked windows, the sun began to set, throwing long shadows across the pavement. But inside that worn-down classroom filled with hope and newfound courage, Terrell had ignited a flame, a promise, brighter than any injustice, that would never again be extinguished. The story of Tyrell Carter is not just a courtroom drama. It's a warning, a battle cry, and a mirror held up to a justice system that too often punishes the powerless while protecting the prejudiced. It forces us to confront a brutal truth, that in certain zip codes with certain skin tones, innocence is not presumed. It must be fought for, clawed back from the jaws of assumption and bias. Tyrell's journey rips the mask off a system that demands obedience from children, but offers them no protection, no compassion, no second chances. He was just 14, bright, curious, walking to school with nothing but a backpack and a dream. And yet, in the eyes of the law, he was reduced to a hoodie, sneakers, and skin color. That was all it took. No fingerprints, no stolen items, no evidence, just a gut feeling from a cop with a record of wrongful arrests. That's the terrifying reality this story lays bare, that for some, identity itself becomes a crime. But in that darkness, Tyrell did something extraordinary. He refused to be broken. He armed himself with knowledge, turned a jail cell into a classroom, and fought back with the very laws designed to silence him. And in doing so, he exposed not just one corrupt officer, but an entire system of shortcuts and shadows. The human lesson here is undeniable. Justice isn't automatic, it's a struggle. And sometimes it takes the voice of a child to remind us that silence isn't safety, and survival isn't the same as freedom. Tyrell's story isn't just about clearing his name. It's about reclaiming dignity and using that reclaimed voice to lift others who are still trapped where he once stood. This is more than a victory. It's a message to every kid who's ever been told they don't matter. You do. And to every system that thinks it can erase that truth, Tyrell Carter is proof that even the smallest voice, when armed with courage, can become unstoppable.